Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The known death toll from the coronavirus pandemic has topped 184,000, with the United States continuing to lead the world in confirmed cases and fatalities. According to Johns Hopkins researchers, more than 46,000 U.S. residents have died of COVID-19. More than 10,000 of the deaths have occurred at nursing homes and other long-term care centers. Here in New York, where the death toll from COVID-19 has passed 15,000. 6 prisoners have died in state prisons, 4 of them at the notorious Sing Sing prison north of New York City. In Chicago, 6 prisoners and 1 guard have died of COVID-19 at the Cook County Jail, where hundreds are sick. In Ohio, a federal judge has ordered the release or transfer of hundreds of elderly or vulnerable prisoners held at the Elkton prison, where 6 people have died of COVID-19. This comes as the American Civil Liberties Union warns U.S. models for the spread of coronavirus may be underestimating future deaths by nearly 100,000 unless counties take immediate steps to reduce jail populations. And the ACLU notes those figures don't even account for state and federal prisons and immigration detention centers. The ACLU warns, quote, unequivocally, keeping people out of jail saves lives, both inside the jail and in the surrounding community. Lives are at stake. The time to act is now, they say. A top scientist at the Department of Health and Human Services says he was removed from his job after resisting President Trump's promotion of an untested coronavirus treatment. Dr. Rick Bright directed the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, known as BARDA, until he was abruptly removed from his post this week and reassigned to the National Institutes of Health. A scathing statement released Wednesday, Dr. Bright wrote, quote, specifically and contrary to misguided directives, I limited the broad use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine promoted by the administration as a panacea, but which clearly lacks scientific merit. While I am prepared to look at all options and to think outside the box for effective treatments, I rightly resisted efforts to provide an unproven drug on demand to the American public. Dr. Bright wrote, BARDA has hired lawyers with the firm Katz, Marshall & Banks, which represents whistleblowers. Bright has. He added in his statement, quote, I will request that the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services investigate the manner in which this administration has politicized the work of BARDA and has pressured me and other conscientious scientists to fund companies with political connections as well as efforts that lack scientific merit, Dr. Bright said. Meanwhile, Reuters reports Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar tapped Brian Harrison, a longtime dog breeder with minimal public health experience, to head the U.S. coronavirus task force just as the first case of COVID-19 was detected in the U.S. In late January, before he joined HHS in 2018, Harrison ran a company called Dallas Labradoodles. At the White House, President Donald Trump reversed course Wednesday and criticized Georgia Republican Governor Brian Kemp, a major ally of the president, after Kemp promised to reopen non-essential businesses Friday.
Spas and the beauty parlors and barber shops, tattoo parlors, I love them. But they can wait a little bit longer, just a little bit, not much, because safety has to predominate. We have to have that. So I told the governor very simply that I disagree with his decision, but he has to do what he thinks is right.
More than 700 people have died of the coronavirus in Georgia, which is one of the slowest testing rates in the U.S. Governors in Tennessee, Florida, and South Carolina are also reopening parks, beaches, and non-essential businesses over the strong objections of public health officials who say reopening now will lead to a second wave of new infections and deaths. In California, a pair of scientific teams reported this week that blood tests found antibodies for the coronavirus in people at dozens of times the known rate of infection. The findings appear to suggest that most cases of COVID-19 are mild, making the disease's mortality rate much lower than previously reported. But many researchers are skeptical, warning the findings were first presented to the press and haven't been peer-reviewed. They're also based on new serology tests that have an unknown rate of false positives. In New Jersey, the director of the State Funeral Directors Association believes COVID-19 has claimed far more lives than officially reported after the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention April 15th ordered changes in how likely deaths due to the disease are reported. In Britain, a review by the Financial Times found UK coronavirus deaths are likely more than double the official figure, with 41,000 deaths so far likely caused by the virus. Here in New York, doctors report a large number of patients hospitalized with COVID-19 are developing high levels of life-threatening blood clots. This is Dr. Jay Moko, Vice Chair of Mount Sinai Health System.
We began to notice as the curve and peak started to really take off in New York City, that across all of New York City, we were seeing a large number of strokes, and that these strokes were extremely concerning, and they were blocking big vessels to the brain. And in treating these patients, they appeared to be very, what we call pro-coagulant, or making lots of clot.
Some doctors have begun treating patients with high doses of a blood-thinning drug even before they present symptoms of blood clotting. In Germany, researchers are beginning human trials of vaccine candidates this week. They join similar trials already underway in the United States, Britain, and China. Health officials warn that even under an accelerated timetable, it may take well over a year before a vaccine becomes widely available, if an effective vaccine is even possible. In New York State, 2 cats have tested positive for novel coronavirus, the first confirmed case of transmission to pets. The cats showed mild symptoms and likely caught the disease from their owners. It's not known if pets can infect humans. On Capitol Hill, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi canceled plans Wednesday to allow lawmakers to cast votes and hold hearings remotely after Republicans objected. Pelosi is scheduled to vote this afternoon on the $484 billion in additional coronavirus relief funding, most of it to replenish the Paycheck Protection Program that provides forgivable loans to small businesses. Lawmakers are expected to take up an even larger Phase 4 coronavirus package in the coming weeks. In a letter to congressional leaders, more than 60 progressive organizations are demanding no additional funding for the Pentagon's $756 billion budget in any future COVID-19 response bills. They write, quote, "The coronavirus pandemic has made it crystal clear that federal spending is dangerously misaligned with our national priorities and actual threats to human security." In Nebraska, meatpacking communities in Hall, Dawson, and Dakota counties are seeing coronavirus cases at a rate 15 times higher than the rest of the state and over 5 times higher than the national average. In Iowa, Tyson Foods Wednesday shut down its pork processing plant in the city of Waterloo, the company's largest pork plant in the nation, after at least 90% of coronavirus cases in Black Hawk County were traced to Tyson plant workers. President Trump on Wednesday signed an executive order suspending the processing of immigrants' green card applications for 60 days. In related news, the Los Angeles Times reports millions of U.S. citizens will not receive coronavirus stimulus checks because they're married to immigrants who use an individual taxpayer identification number, an ID issued by the IRS to workers who don't have a Social Security number. This comes as Education Secretary Betsy DeVos is blocking undocumented college students from receiving coronavirus emergency aid. Congress had allocated $6 billion in its stimulus package to help college students cover living expenses such as food and housing. The Education Department then issued a new guideline mandating the money can only be given to students who qualify for federal financial aid, meaning U.S. citizens and some lawful permanent residents. At the U.S.-Mexico border, Mexican authorities are forcing people recently deported from the U.S. to walk through disinfection tunnels upon their arrival. Recently, there was a large coronavirus outbreak at a shelter in the Mexican border city of Nuevo Laredo after a recently deported person arrived from the U.S. without knowing that he was a carrier of COVID-19. Mexico has over 10,000 cases and a death toll of nearly 1,000 people. In Honduras, Cuba's dispatched another medical brigade to help the country's fragile health system cope with the coronavirus outbreak. COVID-19 cases in Honduras now top 500, leaving hospitals with already weak infrastructure, scarce medicines, and medical staff completely overwhelmed. In Brazil, the largest cemetery in the city of Manaus has begun digging mass graves to handle 100 burials a day, more than 3 times the usual rate, suggesting COVID-19 has taken a much larger toll on the city than the official figure of 156 deaths. The public system in the state of Amazonas has collapsed with 100% of hospital beds occupied, little safety equipment for medical workers and ventilators in critically short supply. Meanwhile, satellite data show deforestation in Brazil's Amazon rainforest has accelerated since the pandemic idled environmental enforcement agents. In Uganda, a women's rights group reports at least 11 pregnant women and several children have died preventable deaths since a nationwide transport ban came into effect as part of a lockdown against the coronavirus. The travel ban has left many Ugandans seeking treatment unable to reach hospitals with ambulances in short supply. South Africa's deployed an additional 70,000 troops to enforce a nationwide lockdown, which began 4 weeks ago. It's the largest internal deployment of South African troops since the end of apartheid in 1994. At least 65 people have died of COVID-19 in South Africa, which has more than 3,600 confirmed cases. In Singapore, about 80% of the country's coronavirus cases have been linked to migrant workers from South Asia who are forced to live in squalid and crowded dormitories, prompting outcry against the Singapore government for not doing enough to protect them. In China, a journalist who'd gone missing for nearly 2 months after posting a video from Wuhan has reportedly reappeared, saying he was detained by police and forcibly quarantined. Li Zihua provided critical reporting from the front lines during some of the worst weeks of the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned Wednesday authoritarian governments are exploiting the pandemic to crack down on human rights.
Against the background of rising ethno-nationalism, populism, authoritarianism, and the pushback against human rights in some countries, the crisis can provide a pretext to adopt repressive measures for purposes unrelated to the pandemic. UN
Secretary General Guterres has called for a global ceasefire of all warring parties in order to focus on battling the coronavirus pandemic. In Somalia, the U.S. military has carried out more airstrikes so far this year than it did during all 8 years of Barack Obama's presidency. U.S. Africa Command says it carried out 39 attacks in Somalia since January 1st, even as the coronavirus continued to spread. Somalia has confirmed 286 cases of coronavirus, but testing remains extremely limited. Somalia's healthcare system is one of the poorest in the world, with just 1 doctor for every 100,000 people. Back in the United States, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo Wednesday said it was Israel's decision whether to annex parts of the occupied West Bank.
As for the annexation of the West Bank, the Israelis will ultimately make those decisions. That's an Israeli decision, and we will work closely with them to share with them our views of this in a private setting.
In response, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said Palestinians, quote, will not stand handcuffed if Israel annexes any part of our land, unquote. In November, 14 members of the UN Security Council rebuked the Trump administration's announcement that it no longer considers Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank illegal under international law. In more news from the Middle East, a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon has reported its first coronavirus case. The Palestinian woman has since been reportedly taken to a hospital in Beirut. At least 3,000 other refugees are housed in a refugee camp. This comes as public health officials and human rights advocates warn of the threat of catastrophic outbreaks in crowded refugee camps around the world that lack sufficient sanitation and medical supplies. And back in the United States, a federal appeals court is allowing the state of Arkansas to enforce a ban on most surgical abortions. Arkansas officials have deemed abortions to be not essential or urgent during the coronavirus outbreak. Meanwhile, a ban on nearly all abortions in Texas during the pandemic appears to be over as clinics began to offer the procedure again starting on Wednesday. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, the center of the pandemic, joined by my co-host Nermeen Sheikh, who is also in New York, but broadcasting from her home instead of where we most like to be, together in the studio, in order to stop community spread. Hi, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.